The torches burned like dying suns along the marble colonnades of Constantinople's hippodrome. 80,000 throats roared as one, their cheers echoing through the night like the growl of an ancient beast hungry for spectacle. The air stank of wine, sweat, and the sweet rot of spilled perfume. Beneath the imperial banners, children, barely 10 years old, were herded into the sand, trembling in the torchlight. Tonight's entertainment was not a race, nor a battle of chariots. It was something older, darker, Leda and the Swan. The ritual had been banned even in Rome's most depraved circuses, yet here, in the shining capital of the Christian world, it had become nightly amusement. The audience laughed as trained geese pecked barley grains from the bare skin of a small girl. Coins clinked against her ribs as men shouted wagers on how long she could endure before she cried. That girl's name was Theodora. She did not scream. Her eyes stared upward at the moon, unblinking, the way a prisoner stares at the only thing she cannot be stripped of. Around her, the crowd howled with pleasure, mistaking her silence for obedience. But inside her, something ancient stirred, not faith, not innocence, but a cold and perfect awareness. She understood, even at 10, that the world was built on appetites, and that those who could feed or control them would rule. Above, the senators and generals leaned forward, faces flushed with lust and laughter. They would forget this child's face by morning, as they had forgotten hundreds before her. But she would not forget theirs. She memorized every gesture, every smirk, every jeweled hand tossing silver. Those hands would one day beg for mercy. When the performance ended, handlers dragged her away into the stone corridors beneath the stands. The roar of the crowd faded, replaced by the dripping of water and the muffled sobs of other children. Theodora walked in silence, her small body shaking, her eyes fixed on the torchlight ahead. Somewhere deep inside her, the pain was already turning into something sharper, a blade she would one day wield. History would remember her as an empress, a lawmaker, a saint to some and a demon to others. But the truth began here, in the sand of the hippodrome, where a 10-year-old girl learned that mercy was a lie, and that power was nothing more than the art of mastering cruelty. The arena created monsters. That night, it created one the empire would never forget. The sound of chains and roaring beasts once echoed through the stone corridors beneath Constantinople's hippodrome. For years, Asychus, Theodora's father, had walked those tunnels with pride. As the bear-keeper of the Green faction, he trained the massive brown bears that thrilled the empire's bloodthirsty crowds. His work gave the family protection, food, and most importantly, a name. In the Byzantine world, that meant survival. But one winter morning, the arena fell silent. The torches burned low, the cages stood open, and the air smelled of iron and decay. Asychus lay motionless in the sawdust, his hands still clenched around a broken chain. Some said a bear turned on him. Others whispered poison. In Byzantium, truth was a luxury few could afford. What mattered was that the bear-keeper was dead, and with him died the safety of his wife and 3 daughters. The rules of the factions were merciless. When a man died, his position was meant to pass to his family. That was the order that kept the fragile machine of loyalty intact. But Asterius, the Green faction's master of entertainment, saw opportunity in death. Gold changed hands in the dark, and by the next sunrise, the job belonged to another man. Theodora's family, once protected by the Green banners, was cast into the streets without coin or shelter. Theodora's mother pleaded for justice, clutching her husband's insignia before the faction's marble office. The guards turned her away. In the shadows, Asterius watched her go, his jeweled fingers closing the ledger of names as if sealing their fate. That night, the mother sat in the corner of their crumbling home, the air heavy with smoke from the city's taverns. Her daughters huddled around her, 3 small outlines in the flickering light. Outside, the crowd's cheers from the hippodrome rose like the laughter of demons. She had nothing left to trade but their lives. Theodora's eyes met her mother's across the dim room. No words were spoken, but the child understood. The empire did not care about their grief. It only fed on survival. When dawn came, the mother gathered her daughters and walked toward the hippodrome gates, the same gates where her husband's beasts once entered to die. Behind her, the morning bells of Constantinople rang cold and hollow, tolling for the bearkeeper's family. That was the day innocence ended. The day a mother chose survival over mercy. The day the empire claimed its next victims, and began forging one of history's deadliest women. The morning sun rose over Constantinople like a blade of fire cutting through fog. The hippodrome, still glistening from the previous night's carnage, prepared for another spectacle. Today, it was not beasts or gladiators that would entertain the crowd, but children. 3 girls stood in the shadows of the marble gate, their faces pale under garlands of laurel placed on their heads. Their tunics were thin and white, meant not for modesty but display. The youngest, Theodora, only 10, clutched her mother's trembling hand. The woman's eyes were hollow, her lips cracked from sleepless nights. Somewhere deep inside, she prayed that by offering her daughters to the arena, she was saving them from starvation. The trumpets blared. The gates opened. And the roar of 80,000 voices swallowed the morning air. The girls stepped into the sand, blinking in the sudden glare of sunlight and fire. Coins rained from the stands, bright, metallic, merciless. The crowd chanted, laughing as the children paraded across the arena floor. It was a ritual of humiliation disguised as performance, a market of flesh conducted under imperial banners. From the high marble balconies, the Green faction, once their protector, turned away, pretending not to see. Asterius, the corrupt official who had stolen their father's post, sipped wine as though the scene were nothing more than theater. But across the stadium, the Blue faction watched in uneasy silence. Perhaps out of pity, or guilt, they ordered that the girl's stepfather be given work among their performers. It was an act that would decide the fate of empires. Because mercy, in Byzantium, was never pure. It always came wrapped in debt. As the parade ended, the crowd erupted once more, the laughter and cheers shaking the ancient walls. Theodora stood motionless, her laurel wreath slipping down her dark hair. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering promises she didn't believe. "You'll be safe now, my child." But Theodora's eyes were fixed on the marble box of the Blues, where the men of power sat, men who could save or destroy with a nod. She memorized their faces, just as she had once memorized those who mocked her. Somewhere beneath the terror and shame, a seed had taken root, a cold understanding that compassion was just another form of control, and that to survive, she must one day learn to wield it. The crowd saw a broken child. History would remember her as the woman who turned pity into a weapon. Behind the glittering marble walls of the hippodrome, where the cheers of 80,000 men echoed like thunder, lay a darker world, a labyrinth of corridors that smelled of oil, incense, and sweat. Here, beneath the empire's proudest monument, the true machinery of Byzantine pleasure turned. Theodora was barely more than a child, yet the law already defined her, actress, a word that in Constantinople meant one thing: prostitute by decree. The empire called it performance, but the curtain of art barely veiled the cruelty beneath. Senators, merchants, and generals all came here to buy illusions, believing they were consuming beauty when, in truth, they were revealing their own decay. Most of the girls cried. Others tried to forget. Theodora watched. She learned that power did not roar, it whispered. It pleaded. It trembled. Men who commanded armies, who passed laws, who sat beside emperors, became pitiful creatures in the flickering lamplight, begging for attention, for affirmation, for the illusion of control. Theodora, small and silent, memorized every gesture, every weakness. The way their hands shook. The way their voices softened when they thought they were unseen. Each night was a lesson, and every humiliation a test. Theodora began to understand that the empire itself was built on appetite, its soldiers fed on conquest, its nobles on greed, its clergy on fear, and its men on desire. She saw that the body was not merely a prison, it could be a weapon. While others broke beneath the weight of shame, she hardened into something sharp and calculating. She smiled when they demanded it, bowed when they expected it, but behind her eyes she built a silent empire of memory. Every touch became a record, every whisper a secret to be used later. In those hidden chambers, Theodora discovered the true language of power, the trembling of hands, the collapse of pride, the instant when desire stripped a man of his soul. By the time she was 12, she no longer saw herself as a victim of their world. She saw herself as its chronicler, its student, its future conqueror. The men who came to the hippodrome believed they were purchasing a child's submission. None realized they were funding the education of the woman who would one day make them bow. Theodora's classroom was corruption itself, and every lesson she learned brought her one step closer to mastering the empire that had once enslaved her. By the time Theodora reached her teens, rumors of her beauty had already spread beyond Constantinople's marble walls. In the far reaches of the empire, men whispered of the girl who never smiled, whose silence could unnerve generals and whose eyes saw straight through deceit. When Hyblas, the Syrian-born governor of Libya, arrived in the capital, he sought diversion, something exotic to parade beside his power. He found Theodora. And with the arrogance of empire, he bought what he thought was perfection. The voyage to Africa was her first taste of freedom disguised as captivity. The sea glimmered like molten bronze as the ship cut through the Mediterranean. Hyblas watched her constantly, bewitched not by her beauty alone but by her composure. She never begged, never wept. She only observed. In his palace at Cyrene, gilded lamps burned through the desert nights. Musicians played soft hymns while servants poured wine into cups of onyx. Hyblas believed he had acquired a prize, a woman carved from marble and trained for pleasure. What he never saw was the calculation behind every movement. For Theodora, this was her education. Each gesture became an experiment, every sigh a test. She learned when a man's pride cracked, how envy bred recklessness, and how pleasure could be weaponized more effectively than steel. The governor, surrounded by his advisors and slaves, began to make small decisions that were not his own. Theodora's voice, always soft, guided his thoughts. Weeks became years, and the puppet strings grew tighter. Theodora studied the way Hyblas reacted to flattery, fear, and silence. When he grew angry, she soothed him. When he felt triumphant, she withdrew, forcing him to chase her approval like an addict craving poison. But the moment she began steering his political decrees, changing the fates of cities with her words, he saw it. The spell shattered. Rage replaced fascination. "You think you rule me?" he roared, shattering a golden goblet against the marble floor. Guards dragged her through the palace gates into the blinding desert sun. Her possessions burned behind her, the smoke rising like the ghost of everything she had endured. But Theodora did not collapse. She walked into the dunes barefoot, her hair whipping in the wind. Each grain of sand cut into her skin like a vow. Hyblas thought he had discarded a concubine. In truth, he had released a predator. From that moment, Theodora ceased to be anyone's possession. She had learned the empire's oldest secret, that desire was just another form of domination, and she would never again be the one dominated. The Mediterranean stretched before her like a living furnace, waves burning bronze beneath the sun. Cast out from the palace of Hyblas, Theodora had nothing, no wealth, no protection, no name. But she carried something far sharper than coin, knowledge. The lessons carved into her flesh in Constantinople and refined in Libya now became weapons she would wield across the sea. She survived as she always had, by selling the illusion men craved. Merchants, captains, minor nobles, each believed they were buying a girl's submission. In truth, they were purchasing an education for their destroyer. Theodora listened as they whispered secrets in drunken confidence, routes of trade caravans, weaknesses in rival fleets, smuggling operations buried in ship ledgers. Every word they thought forgotten she stored away like gold in a vault. In the stinking holds of ships, beneath swaying lanterns, she turned every encounter into a classroom. She learned the accents of Syria, the dialects of Egypt, the arrogance of Rome. She saw how desire stripped the wealthy bare, how fear of exposure could enslave men more effectively than chains. By the time her feet touched new harbors, she was not merely surviving, she was studying empires. In Alexandria, the great library long gone to ash, Theodora found another form of power, religion. The Monophysite Christians, despised by imperial orthodoxy, welcomed her. She knelt at their altars, the smoke of incense rising into her dark hair, and let them believe she sought salvation. In truth, she sought independence. For the first time, she had a base of support outside the factions, outside the hippodrome, outside the empire's games. The church was not her faith, it was her fortress. From Alexandria, she traveled to Antioch, where markets bustled with gossip as much as grain. There, amid the crowd, she heard whispers that chilled her blood. A man of power, Prince Justinian himself, had begun asking questions. Who was the girl who had escaped Libya? Who was the former performer who still walked the empire's roads? Senators laughed at the curiosity of the heir, but Theodora knew better. Curiosity was the first step toward obsession. As her ship approached the harbors of Constantinople once again, she stood at the stern, the wind tearing at her cloak. The golden domes of the city gleamed in the distance like a vision of vengeance. She had left as a child condemned to humiliation. Now she returned as a predator, armed with secrets, strategy, and the rumor of a prince who sought her name. The sea that had once been her prison had become her crucible. And from it, Theodora emerged tempered, sharpened, ready to carve her destiny into the empire that had betrayed her. When Theodora returned to Constantinople, the city shimmered like a mirage of gold and smoke. From the marble towers to the perfumed halls of the palace, whispers already preceded her, the performer who had survived Libya, the woman who could make men confess their sins with a glance. But Theodora had not returned for redemption. She had come for conquest. Prince Justinian, heir to the Byzantine throne, was 40 years old and known more for his intellect than his passions. Yet when he first saw Theodora at a private gathering of courtiers, the world he had so carefully built began to fracture. She did not flirt. She did not flatter. She spoke to him as if he were mortal, and for the first time in his life, he felt it. The seduction that followed was not born of lust, but of design. Every movement, every pause, every silence was calibrated. Theodora knew how to create longing, not through touch, but through distance. When Justinian tried to impress her with tales of law and empire, she listened with gentle indifference. When he offered gifts, she refused them with a faint smile. It was not submission that captivated him, it was her mastery of control. At night, he dreamed of her voice, the calm rhythm that had entered his mind like a spell. Within months, Justinian could no longer make a decision without her counsel. Ministers noticed his distraction, senators whispered about his uncharacteristic softness. But Theodora was not a courtesan chasing favor, she was an architect rebuilding an empire, one man at a time. Then came the scandal. Justinian, blinded by obsession, declared his intent to marry her. The court erupted. Nobles spat words like prostitute, actress, blasphemy. The laws of Constantine forbade such a union, once an actress, always an outcast. Yet Justinian defied them all. Only one stood in his way, Empress Euphemia, the emperor's wife and Justinian's adoptive mother. She had risen from slavery to power, and she recognized the same hunger in Theodora's eyes that had once burned in her own. But where Euphemia had climbed by servitude, Theodora ascended by manipulation. "You are not like me," the empress said coldly. "I became free without corruption. You enslave with it." Theodora said nothing. She simply bowed. That winter, 523 CE, Euphemia died in her sleep. No illness. No struggle. Just silence. By dawn, a new law appeared, the act of redemption, permitting former actresses to marry men of senatorial rank. Within days, Theodora stood beside Justinian as his betrothed. The city's bells tolled not for mourning, but for the birth of a new reign, one forged not by faith or blood, but by psychological conquest. Theodora had not seduced a man. She had seduced an empire. In the spring of 525 CE, the great domes of Hagia Sophia shimmered like molten gold. Incense thickened the air, the chant of priests rising like a tide against marble walls. At the center of that holy theater walked Theodora, no longer the child of the hippodrome, no longer the courtesan of Libya, but a woman cloaked in imperial purple. Each step she took down the aisle echoed across centuries of humiliation. Her robe, woven with gold thread and marked by the imperial eagle, dragged across the marble like a shroud of vengeance. The crowd saw a coronation. Theodora knew it was an execution, for every memory of weakness, every man who had once called her property. Beside her, Justinian watched with awe that bordered on fear. The incense burned his throat, yet he did not move. When he placed the golden diadem upon her head, the city erupted in celebration. Bells tolled, banners unfurled, and the empire welcomed its new empress. But within the hymn of victory, Theodora heard something else, the whisper of all the dead who had shaped her. 7 years later, that whisper became a roar. The Nika revolt, born from the same factions that had once enslaved her family, turned Constantinople into a furnace. The Blues and the Greens, those eternal rivals, joined forces for the first time, demanding blood, freedom, and the downfall of the crown. For 5 days, the city burned. The sky glowed red over the hippodrome, the very arena that had birthed her nightmares. Senators fled. Generals argued. Even Justinian, once the architect of law and empire, spoke of abandoning the city. Then Theodora rose. She stood before the trembling court, her purple cloak falling like a curtain of flame. Her eyes were cold, her voice sharper than steel. "My opinion," she declared, "is that the present time is not the moment for flight. Royalty is a fine burial shroud. I shall never see the day when I am not addressed as mistress." The room fell silent. The generals lowered their eyes. Even Justinian bowed his head. In that moment, the empress who had survived degradation and exile became something more than human. She became Byzantium itself, unyielding, merciless, radiant with divine cruelty. By dawn, the emperor's legions sealed the hippodrome gates. 30,000 rebels were trapped within the same sands where Theodora's innocents had once died. When the killing was done, the city lay in silence. Smoke drifted over the domes. From her balcony, Theodora watched the sun rise through the haze of blood and incense. She had kept her word. If she was to die, it would be wrapped in purple. Not as a victim, but as an empress who had turned humiliation into empire. The same arena that had once devoured Theodora's childhood now stood silent beneath a sky of smoke. The hippodrome, where she had been paraded as a child for the amusement of men, was filled once again with a roaring crowd. But this time, they were not spectators. They were prisoners. 30,000 rebels, blues and greens alike, had been herded into the stone colossus that had birthed their hatred. They shouted for mercy, for justice, for freedom. But the woman standing above them on the imperial balcony remembered another chorus, the cheers of men throwing coins at her 10-year-old body. The torches flickered against the marble, casting long shadows across the sand. Theodora stood beside Justinian, her face unreadable. When his generals hesitated, she did not. "Seal the gates," she said quietly. The bronze doors clanged shut with a sound like the end of the world. From the tunnels below, the imperial legions emerged, rows of armored soldiers with swords drawn, faces hidden behind iron masks. The crowd began to chant again, but this time it was fear, not defiance. Theodora raised her hand. The gesture was small. The slaughter was not. Steel met flesh. The cries of the dying rose and merged into one vast, unbroken scream. The sand that had once been her stage turned red. Men trampled over their own children. Smoke and dust filled the air, choking the sound of prayer. It was not battle. It was cleansing. From her balcony, Theodora did not look away. The memories of her humiliation, her exile, her pain, all of it seemed to burn in the torches below. She had become what the empire had taught her to be, merciless, calculating, divine. By midday, the hippodrome was silent again. The only movement came from crows circling the blood-soaked sand. Below, bodies lay piled like offerings at an altar of vengeance. When Justinian finally turned to speak, his voice trembled. "It is done," he whispered. But Theodora's gaze remained on the arena. Her expression was calm, almost serene. "No," she said softly. "It has only begun." The hippodrome had once been her prison, her classroom, her crucible. Now it was her masterpiece, a monument to the empire's cruelty, and to her mastery of it. Theodora had completed the cycle. The victim had become the executioner. And in the heart of Byzantium, the sands of the hippodrome ran red with the proof that power, once born of suffering, would always demand blood to sustain itself. The hippodrome had been cleansed with blood, but Theodora's vengeance did not end with slaughter. Where swords could not reach, she sent laws. Her revenge was no longer measured in corpses, it was written in ink. From her palace chambers, beneath mosaics that gleamed like divine eyes, the Empress began to rebuild the empire in her image. She outlawed forced prostitution and decreed that any man guilty of rape would face death, and that his wealth would be given to his victim. For the first time in Byzantine law, women's suffering carried the weight of justice. Yet her mercy was never free. She established the Metanoia convent, a sanctuary where fallen women could repent. But the high stone walls and barred gates spoke of captivity, not salvation. Inside, hundreds of women prayed endlessly, their voices rising like the cries of ghosts. They were saved from one master only to be chained to another. Theodora had learned from empire itself, that power was not about violence, but control. The same methods that once enslaved her were now the foundation of her rule: obedience, isolation, dependency. She was the empire's first social engineer, reshaping behavior through law and guilt. As the years passed, her influence seeped into every corner of Byzantine life. Justinian, once the brilliant architect of empire, now bent beneath her unseen hand. When she spoke, his decrees echoed her words. When she died in 548 CE, the empire trembled. Justinian never recovered. He ruled for 17 more years but never remarried, never smiled, never dared to undo what she had created. Theodora's mind lived on inside his greatest work, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the legal code that would shape Western law for centuries. Hidden within its clauses were traces of her own past, the laws of punishment, of submission, of moral correction. But Theodora's shadow stretched beyond Byzantium. Her psychological empire endured. Modern systems, education, therapy, corporate management, all carried echoes of her design. Programs that broke wills to rebuild obedience. Structures that promised salvation through surrender. The same techniques born in the hippodrome's darkness had become the pillars of civilization. When historians spoke of her, they called her a reformer, a saint, a feminist before her time. But beneath every reform lay the same principle she had learned in childhood, that freedom and control were twins, inseparable and dangerous. Theodora's legacy was not mercy. It was mastery. She had proven that trauma could build empires, that victims, once broken and remade, could construct entire worlds upon the bones of their suffering. And so, centuries later, her warning still lingers. Every system that claims to save you may only be perfecting the art of control.